Coming to you from Jacksonville, Florida, this is GovLove, a podcast about local government, brought to you by engaging local government leaders. I'm Ben Kittelson, manager at Tellus and GovLove co-host. We've got a great episode for you today. We're going to be talking climate resilience and older adults. But first, the best way to support GovLove is to become a member of Engaging Local Government Leaders. ELGL is a professional association engaging the brightest minds in local government. And your membership helps support this podcast. So if you want to hear more great conversations like the one we're going to have today, you should go become a member. And you can also follow GovLove on LinkedIn. So obviously we have our social media channels through ELGL. But if you never want to miss a GovLove episode, go ahead and give us a follow on our page on LinkedIn. Now, let me introduce today's guest. Danielle Arigoni is the Managing Director for Policy and Solutions at the National Housing Trust, a position she's been in since 2022. And prior to her taking on her current role, she's the Director of Livable Communities for AARP for about 5 years. And she's the author of a new book called Climate Resilience for an Aging Nation. She's also held several leadership positions in HUD's Office of Sustainable Communities and EPA's Smart Growth Office between 2000 and 2017. And she serves as a board member of Smart Growth America and the League of American Bicyclists. So with that, Danielle, welcome to GovLove. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ben. Glad to be here.
Cool. So we have a tradition on the podcast to start with a lightning round to get to know our guest a little better. So my first question for you, what book are you currently reading?
Right now I'm reading Solito by Javier Zamora, which tells the story of a child, an El Salvadoran child who makes a migration to the U.S. So I'm about halfway through. So he's in Mexico at the moment and about to cross over, but it's a pretty, compelling book and certainly relevant these days with all the crisis we face at the border. Yes.
Wow. Yeah, very timely. Oh, fascinating. All right. My next lightning round question for you: cake or pie?
Oh, pie every day. We're pie snobs here in my family. We're real big pie snobs. So it got to be the homemade crust, got to be the homemade fillings. Pie.
What's the go-to type of pie?
You know what? I love a good lemon meringue pie or a good chocolate cream pie, but my kids will almost always choose apple pie. Go figure. I'll eat any pie. I love it.
Yeah. You're not picky about pie.
I'm not picky. It's just as long as it's homemade pie, I'm good.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Then my next lightning question for you. What was the first album that you bought?
I have a really clear memory of holding a cassette tape when I was like 13 years old. And it had to be the album called What Time Is It? By The Time, which is like a Prince adjacent band.
Okay.
At the time then, and still now, I'm a huge Prince fan. But I was like, why wasn't my first album a Prince album? I don't know, but it was The Time. But
that's the
it's all about Prince throughout my whole life. Yeah.
I love that. All right. And then my last lightning round question for you. Where do you go for inspiration?
Ooh, I think honestly, like outside, that sounds so dorky and like boring, but like just being able to clear the mind, like getting on my bike and just riding and having no stimulation is honestly what's inspiring to me. And I will say too, there's a state park about an hour and a half away from here. And every time I'm there, it's called Shenandoah River State Park. Every time I'm there, I just find myself totally at ease and like at one with the universe. So those are my happy places, on my bike and in that park.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, there's something about getting on a bike and just, especially when you don't have to be anywhere at any certain time. You're just like out for a ride. That is lovely.
Even commuting to work, it's still like the most zen way to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. Yeah. All right. So I always like asking guests how they end up kind of doing the work that they're doing. And so, you're on today to talk about your book, but you also have a day job. So I'm curious about your path into both, writing the book of the, on this topic, and then also kind of working for the National Housing Trust. So what was your path to kind of where you are today in your career?
Yeah, it's been a windy one. I will say that is definitely not linear. So I think often, like I, as you said, I work at National Housing Trust now, and we're a nonprofit affordable housing developer who works primarily in the Mid-Atlantic, but we also do lending and solar and policy work that affects the whole country. And for me, it's kind of like a homecoming because I feel like I started in this journey with a real interest in affordable housing. And I can kind of trace that back to like being in high school and being brought along by a family friend of ours to volunteer in a homeless shelter. And it really stuck with me, just the importance of housing and kind of what housing stability means for people's ability to survive, not just survive, but to thrive. So housing affordability has always been kind of a consistent theme over my career. But I would say, and that was the case at EPA when I worked in the Smart Growth Office and kind of led some of the affordable housing work there and the green building work. But then it wasn't really until I got to be at HUD where I got to work really more intentionally around climate. And that was sort of a pivot point for me in terms of having a sense that I could make a contribution through, land use policy and the like to impact both our carbon emissions, but also how we adapt to climate change. And then when we had a new president in 2016 who wasn't all that interested in our climate resilience work and our green building work at HUD, I took the opportunity to leave the federal government and landed in the very best lifeboat I ever could have landed in, which was AARP.
Yeah.
And that was really pivotal for me as well, not just because it gave me a chance to really build up what I think is a pretty impactful national program around the country, working in every state to help advance housing, transportation, and public space solutions for older adults, because that really also helps to create more equitable communities for everyone. But that also really kind of helped me identify and understand the ways in which I think we don't adequately consider older adults' needs, which then gets me kind of to the current day of putting all those pieces together and looking at how our failure to account for older adults' needs in our climate resilience planning is really problematic and delivering pretty bad outcomes, not just for older adults, but also a poor trajectory for our communities. And I'm a planner, so I tend to think that a lot of things can be solved by land use fixes. There's a lot that can be done in land use, but it also really brought to my attention and helped me understand the roles of so many more sectors that have a hand in creating more climate resilient communities as well.
Yeah, very cool. No, I can't wait to dig in on that with you. So
yeah,
you said one thing about your time at HUD. So one of my personal hobby horses is, I think, one of the biggest things local governments, the levers they have to fight, climate change and to be more sustainable is land use. So I'm curious, from your work at HUD, what were some of the things that the federal government's trying to do or was trying to do at that time? Obviously, things have changed several years ago now, but what were some of the things you guys were trying to do at that federal level to think about land use and how that relates to climate change and sustainability?
Well, I think there's a couple. I mean, the two really big ones that come to mind is, first of all, I was really privileged to be a part of a sort of 3-agency initiative called the HUD DOT EPA Partnership for Sustainable Communities, which was a fixture throughout the Obama administration. And I think the important thing about that is that it really, for the first time, forced federal agencies to work across silos and align programs. So we all know that transportation investments impact housing and that impact environmental outcomes. But each of those agencies has their own mission and their own justification that they have to kind of follow, that's given to them by Congress or their own mandate. And it's really hard, honestly, to kind of fuse those silos. So that partnership was all about creating connections across agencies, and it materialized in some really impactful grants that we administered at HUD, the Sustainable Communities Initiative grants. It reached like 143 communities around the country and really forced folks to think about regional planning and cross-sectoral planning. So that was one. And I think the legacies of that work still live on today. The other thing that, and to be totally frank, what drew me to HUD was a really innovative program that we were implementing at the time called the National Disaster Resilience Competition. And this was really thinking about how we can leverage disaster recovery funds, which are allocated by Congress after emergencies. It's kind of a one-time infusion, oftentimes by Congress to HUD, to pass along to entities, local governments, in the form of CDBG dollars, which we all know are very flexible, right? CDBG dollars are great tools for communities. And there's a flavor of those that's disaster recovery driven. And so what this competition aimed to do is not just kind of parse out money in a formulaic way, but award it in a competitive way. And the reason it was innovative is because it caused all of the applicants to really think about, what does it look like to build back more resiliently? Not just to build back by how we are, but build back to be better, so that the next time the disaster comes or another disaster comes, we've thought in advance about what that resilience looks like, and we're making investments to get us there now, or making investments now to get us there in the future. So it was a really impactful program. And I think, again, it really set the stage for a lot of subsequent climate-related work that's still going on today in different ways.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. No, that's fascinating. Well, and just in your response, I can hear kind of the echoes in your or from your book, or it's almost like some of your jobs led you to this. So
They
it's very
totally
cool.
did. I really think it's this windy path that I don't think this book would exist if I hadn't made all these weird job jumps. So it's
Yeah,
all good, you know.
yeah, yeah. So for listeners, again, the book is called Climate Resilience for an Aging Nation. And so, you touched on this a little bit, but can you talk more about kind of what made you want to write this book? Obviously, your time at AARP sounds like it informed it. Obviously, your work before informed it when you were at HUD and EPA. But so what were why'd you want to actually write this all down and put it into a book?
Yeah. To be honest, I almost felt like I had no choice. That sounds weird, but after working on climate since 2016 or so, and obviously in various ways before that, we're always thinking about kind of environmental impacts of land use when I worked at EPA, but it wasn't till I really got to be at HUD where we were focused on climate resilience and adaptation. Once you get a taste of that, you really can't do anything else. I mean, you see everything from the perspective of climate risk. And then similarly, when I got to AARP, once you work and focus your efforts on the needs of older adults for 5 years, and you think about what a better housing approach looks like, what a more inclusive transportation system looks like, what more responsive public spaces look like, you also can't not see that. You can't unsee that, So when you put those two things together, I just felt like there was a real story to be told in how the blind spots that I observed in the built environment as it pertains to creating livable communities really also posed additional risk with regards to climate change. And the reason that's so important is because we already see the effects of it. I mean, we see in nearly every disaster that has occurred over the last 20 years that older adults are dying at a far higher rate, 2, 3, 4, 5 times as great a death rate as the general population. And it's almost predictable at this point, sadly. I mean, when the Lahaina wildfires occurred last summer, like I could have predicted what the death rate would be. And sure enough, it turned out to be 73% of the people who died were over 60. So we know this is going to happen. And it just bothered me so much that we didn't care enough to fix it. It seems like we didn't care enough to fix it. And when I dug a little deeper, I really realized that it was because people don't understand the connections between climate and aging. And I think that's because the aging world tends to be very siloed. It comes out of a different discipline. It comes out of gerontology and healthcare and community health, public health, whereas climate resilience tends to come out of environmental practices and mapping and land use. And those two things don't always talk to one another. And then when you throw emergency management into the mix, that comes out of an entirely different kind of mindset. That's public safety. And in some cases, folks who come out of, military. So people talk different languages, and therefore there was a real lack of understanding of how these three things intersect. And I really felt so, I guess, filled with passion for this topic that I kind of had to get it off my chest. I sat down one day and kind of wrote out an outline of what a book could be, and I was even surprised at how much of it sort of like came pouring out of me.
Yeah. Well, I love you framed it the same way in the book, but the busting down of those silos is like it's a really good point that like those three disciplines exist almost on their own. And so but there is so much overlap. So that I really like that. Well, and maybe to frame up some of the like importance of this topic, can you talk a little about some of the demographic trends? Obviously, there's a ton of detail in the book about this, but just for folks that maybe aren't familiar with like, how rapidly our nation is aging and what that kind of means. Like, can you talk a little about that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I really think that was another real wake-up call, I think, for me when I landed at AARP, was not having a full understanding of what the implications were of our demographic trends. And what I know now and what we know now is that older adults are the fastest growing demographic in our country. We're living longer, which makes sense that therefore there's going to be more older adults around and occupying a larger share of communities. And in fact, in just 10 years, in 2034, we'll be a country comprised of more people over 65 than under 18 for the first time ever. So whereas 100 years ago, 1 in 20 people was 65, today 1 in 6 is. And it's not that far away where it'll be 1 in 5. And many parts of our country, frankly, are already there. But that really, to me, is a real wake-up call in terms of who is it we're planning for. and what their ages are, and acknowledging the fact that the needs of older adults are going to be different in many cases than the rest of the population.
Yeah.
The other element I would say too is that older adult demographic is increasingly diverse. So whereas 25% of older adults in 2020 were people of color, African Americans, Hispanics, Latinos, or Asians, in just a few years, by 2040, that's going to be more than a third. And again, in some parts of the country, like California, that's accelerating at a much faster rate. So when you think about what age means as a layer on top of all of the health disparities and economic disparities that are experienced by different races, ethnicities, economic status, age is just another layer on top of those conditions, those preconditions that people are already living with. So it becomes really important to understand how age accelerates, magnifies, exacerbates risk, and how we then need to sort of adjust our approaches to account for that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, you mentioned that earlier, that like the older population is at risk of any kind of climate event, like heat, cold, like hurricanes. Like those are the folks that we see, like you said, that end up, dying at a higher rate. And then the fact that population is also increasing by quite a bit, like it requires a change in kind of maybe attitude. And so you sort of touched on this. I want you to kind of expand on the intersecting identities and risk factors and how that kind of relates, and why climate change kind of makes that even, I don't know, even worse, I guess. But like kind of intersecting of those things, like that was a really interesting way to think about the risk profile.
Yeah, I think part of the reason that we find ourselves in the situation where we have such an incredibly disproportionate impact of disasters on older adults is that we planners, I'll say we local government folks, because I even though I'm in a national nonprofit, I really feel most affinity with people who are at the community scale, who are trying to affect change in the places where they live and where they work. We in that role, or in those roles, don't necessarily have a great understanding of who older adults are or what their needs are. And I think there's often a lot of preconceptions that we bring to that challenge. I think there's a preconception that, well, most older adults live in nursing homes or assisted living facilities, so there's someone there to care for them. That's really only the case for 2.5% of older adults. 98% of older adults live in the community, and of those, 30% live alone. So, how are you thinking about reaching those 30% of older adults who live alone, who may not be in the workforce anymore, who may not be able to leave their home very easily, who may not have much human contact at all? The Surgeon General has talked about an epidemic of loneliness. We all experienced this in COVID, but there are older adults for whom that is their daily reality because they are isolated. And then you layer on top of that, the realities that many older adults don't drive. 20% of older adults don't drive. There's a real financial strain that impacts many older adults as well. Again, another preconception, I think, is that people are out there on the golf course or hitting the cruises because they've got these big fat retirement nest eggs that they're enjoying. And sure, that's the case for some, but 1 in 6 older adults live near or below the poverty line. And half of older renters are housing cost burdened, meaning they're paying more than 30% of their rent for housing, their income for housing. So there's a lot of financial, I think, realities that frankly are just not well understood and not well discussed. And then when you add on to that, the sort of health preconditions that many people live with, the Alzheimer's Association estimates that 1 in 9 older adults lives with dementia, lives with Alzheimer's disease. And we know that something like 20% of older adults need help with activities of daily living, which is a kind of a term of art in the aging world that includes hearing, seeing, self-care, walking in some cases. 80% of older adults live with 2 or more chronic medical conditions. So again, there's a lot of sort of, pre-existing conditions that people are living with on a daily basis that, when you intersect that with the climate risks that we all experience, really add to their challenge and really add to their vulnerability.
Yeah. Well, and before you even get to the climate risk stuff, which obviously we're going to talk more about, just the built environment itself doesn't seem to be built for older adults. And so I think you had a line in the book about like, hey, we don't know how to build, or we don't build communities well for this population. And so what are some of those things that, like, before we get to even climate,
Yeah.
and you've touched on them already, some of the things that, like, hey, just the way we're building cities now and communities now means it's harder as an older adult to like get around and live your day-to-day life independently.
Absolutely. I mean, this is kind of really at the heart of AARP's Livable Communities Initiative, which I think is such a great tool and mechanism, and a whole suite of resources that come with that. In particular, something called the AARP Network of Age-Friendly States and Communities, which is a way for localities and states to kind of commit to being more age-friendly. What those communities often find when they kind of step back and look at their built environment and their social infrastructure is that there are a lot of shortcomings when it comes to older adults. We're not creating the right kind of housing stock that would allow for people to downsize out of their larger homes into smaller homes in the communities where they already live. That's because many communities are zoned single family zoning, and you can't build a duplex or a townhouse or a multifamily building or even an accessory dwelling unit in the vast majority of the country. Thankfully, that's changing, and we're starting to see a softening of some of those zoning barriers so that we can create a more diverse housing stock. And when we do that, I think it opens the door for more accessible housing, where you have zero-step entries and more accessible and universal design considerations in homes, so that, again, when people need to find a housing solution that fits their needs better, there are options in the communities where they live. So that's one way. The other way is in transportation. I mean, we are such an auto-centric, country, and that's not a surprise to anyone. But again, think about the fact that 20% of older adults don't drive. When they stop driving, their mobility and their ability to live independently becomes wholly dependent on other people, whether that's friends or family driving them, or whether that's paratransit or public transit. And, we've all seen what public transit has gone through in the last few years. Public transit system already isn't sufficiently invested in to serve many people's needs. I was just reading a Twitter post today about, bus stops, and the fact that, there are so many bus stops out there that represent just a single pole with a metal sign at the top that says, here's what the bus lines are. When I see those, I actually cringe. Like it's painful to me to see those, because it is such a lack of consideration for the people who use the system and who rely on the system. So for older adults, whether they're walking through a park or whether they're waiting for a bus, they need a place to sit. They need a little bit of shading. Those kinds of component parts is what makes a public transit system or a park system usable for older adults. But often those are afterthoughts, and often those are not part of the conversation. So there really are a lot of, I think, shortcomings in the built environment that we see now that inhibit people's ability to age in place. And that's a problem, because first of all, we already are having a housing crunch. And so if we have people who are overhoused, not selling their large homes, not being able to downsize, that kind of clogs up our whole housing system, which, I spend most of my day job thinking about. But it's also just not a good solution for older adults. Frankly, they're stuck in homes that are too large, that are too expensive to heat and cool, where they can't afford the maintenance and upkeep, and where they're, frankly, more likely to be isolated if they're living in a single family home than in a community that has a more compact, dense, sort of interconnected way of, connecting people.
Yeah. I hadn't heard or hadn't thought about the way that being overhoused can kind of clog up the system. So that's really, I know this is a little bit off topic of your book, but what is that? Cause I think, does that have to do with kind of like the filtering effect of, as folks kind of go through, their lives, they kind of like filter into, or as they can afford newer and better homes, they kind of, older homes kind of filter down to and become more affordable. Is that kind of part of that system?
Ideally, yes. But if you think about people who are living in older homes, who've lived there for decades and who have those homes fully paid off, but now they're living in a 4-bedroom home because their kids have grown up. But if there are not options that suit their needs in the communities that they know and where they have familiarity, then they're not going to leave.
Oh,
And
interesting.
about we all see of the number of communities that prohibit multifamily zoning,
Hmm.
that just don't allow apartments or even low rise 4-story buildings to be constructed. Like if a community were to integrate more of those kinds of housing solutions, not to mention things like accessory dwelling units or missing middle solutions, then you're offering people a choice. You're giving people a chance to stay in the community where they know their neighbors, where they go to church, where they know their doctor, is a 5-minute drive away, and find the right housing fit for them.
Yeah.
But in communities that offer only one housing product, as the vast majority of our country does,
Mhm.
there's no other option. And
Yeah.
nursing home care and congregate living is so expensive that people put that off until they absolutely have to go there because it's just so expensive.
Yeah. Yeah. No, this is fascinating. So this is something that echoes my experience of reading your book a bit, where like, oh, this population intersects with some of the, I don't know, urbanism issues, land use, transportation, housing, like those kind of issues that I'm interested in as a local government nerd.
Yeah.
But obviously, this population, they're particularly impacted by all of those things. They're almost like it's an interesting cross section where like they're able to their their experience is like touching on all these different policy issues that
Yeah.
can kind of otherwise might be seen as independent.
Yeah.
It was really interesting. Yeah.
I'll be honest. Like I've done, as we talked about at the top, like I've done a lot of different jobs and a lot of different
Hmm.
roles over my career. Early on, the language we used was smart growth as a way of
Yeah.
promoting kind of dense development, mix of land uses, or an array of transportation options. When I got to HUD, we talked about sustainable communities, same solutions. When I get to ARP, we call age-friendly communities, same solutions.
Yeah.
It all comes back to, I will say, good urbanism. I'll agree with you on that. Although it applies in not just urban places. I mean, it really is about how can we thoughtfully design the built environment where we center people's needs first
Mm-hmm.
and include the array of people and their needs, whether they are walking, whether they're in a wheelchair, whether they ride a bike, whether they live alone. Like, how are
Yeah.
we thinking about the wide array of needs? And as much as I'm a mother of 4, I love, children's needs, and
Yeah.
obviously centering children's needs is, I think, more often discussed as part of this sort of, bike to school and walk to school initiatives and things
Mm-hmm.
like that. And that's useful. But I think it's a missed opportunity to also say, and what about older adults? What is
Yeah.
it that their needs are, and how might those align with, but be slightly different than the
Yeah.
needs of youth? Because as the amazing Gil Peñalosa would say, when you serve the needs of the 80-year-old, you're also serving the needs of the 8-year-old and everyone in between. So it really
Yeah.
is this all ages approach to thinking about how we design communities.
Yeah. No, I love that. Well, and I think not to speculate too much, but the politics of serving aging is probably an easier lift than, because like everyone ages, everyone knows
Yep.
their parents are older.
Exactly.
Like,
And that is why that is one of the great joys that I had at ARP, was being able to talk about the things that I really care about from the frame of age-friendly communities,
yeah.
because you see a lot more receptivity in places
Yeah.
where if you use the exact same language and called it sustainable communities, people's
Or
ears would
urbanism.
shut off.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so again, I don't really care what we call it. I really don't care. We
Yeah.
just need to build communities better.
Yeah.
And if age friendly is the friend that carries the day, great.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Because it is sustainable. It is age friendly. It is smart growth. It's all of those things. And we just need to build it as fast as possible.
Oh, yeah. Well said. I love that. Awesome. So yeah. So now let's kind of maybe shift to some of the like climate resilience aspects, where
Yeah.
obviously there's all this work that can be done just to make places age friendly. But then on the kind of climate resilience side, what are some of the things that maybe, I don't know if they're policies or like strategies that like that governments can do to make their community more climate resilient with the emphasis on those older adults. And so I don't know if there's things that come to mind that like particularly local governments maybe can focus on, or what those maybe strategies are around climate resilience.
Yeah, there's a lot, I would say, and I'll start a little bit by maybe backing into the answer by way of explaining, like, the impacts of climate on older adults aren't just in disasters. And while that is tragic, and while that is shocking, and I hope it rocks everyone to their boots, the fact that 85% of the people who died in the California Camp Fire were over 60, and 63% of the people who died in the winter storms in Buffalo were over 60. And, time and time again, that's the case. There's a lot of impacts that happen sort of on a daily basis in this new normal that are also impacting older adults. And one of the big ones, for example, is utility costs and extreme heat. So when you think about extreme heat, it's something that, again, all of us are experiencing. We just finished the hottest year on record. I think I just read a news story that said we've just finished the 7th hottest month on record, consistently. So we continue to beat records about heat, which is terrifying. But what that means for people, for older adults in particular, it hits older adults in a different way. And frankly, it hits them in a more insidious way, because older bodies don't process heat the same way that younger bodies do. And the illustrations or the symptoms of heat disease can mirror or mimic other diseases or chronic illnesses that older adults are already living with. So they might go untreated, they might go unnoticed. Moreover, it can complicate some of the prescription drugs that people are on, particularly if they're being treated for heart disease or diabetes or overweight. Heat just layers risk on top of all those things. And again, remember that 80% of people over 60 live with 2 or more chronic conditions. So heat really is a really dangerous thing for older adults. There was an estimate that 12,000 people died from heat-related illnesses, which is more deaths than any other weather-related illness.
Yeah.
And of those 12,000, 80% are people over 60. 60, I'm sorry. So again, just time and time again, we see that older adults pay the price and really bear the consequence of this, bear the brunt of this. So what that means from a local government perspective, to answer your question, it's thinking about how could we pay attention to the systems or the solutions that can protect older adults from extreme heat. So that might look like cooling centers or resilience hubs that offer resources to people to stay cool during times of extreme heat. But, in order to do that effectively, you really have to think about how are people going to get there. It's not enough to just dedicate a library to be a cooling center if you can't ensure that older adults can't reach it, particularly for those 1 in 5 who don't drive. It's also thinking about how can we deliver resources to older adults to help them weatherize their homes so that they aren't quite as worried about the cost of cooling them as they might otherwise be. Already there's a huge crisis in terms of older adults' ability to pay their utility bills. Something like 10 million households led by people over 60. And keep in mind, there's like 50 or 60 million households of that population as a whole. 10 million of them are energy insecure. And 7 million of those had to go without food or medical necessities to pay a utility bill in the past year. So again, already older adults are confronted by highly volatile utility bills that really inform their decision. Can I withstand this heat in my home, or can I afford to turn the AC on? And from a local government perspective, a lot of these houses are not, particularly if older adults have lived in them for a while, these homes are not weatherized. These homes may not be best suited to efficient heating and cooling. So again, what are the resources we can get to help with weatherization? What are the resources we can get to help deploy new technologies? With Inflation Reduction Act right now, there's so many funds, so many resources out there to install climate-friendly systems that reduce energy consumption, going so far as even to install renewable energy. So if you're able to connect an older adult with benefits that enable them to install solar, that then mean that their utility costs drop significantly, that's how you can begin to turn the tide on older adults, expanded risk with regards to heat. So I could go on and on, but there's lots of things that local governments can do. And that's just on heat as one example.
Yeah. No, well, and I love that because it can seem so overwhelming, I would think, as a local government administrator to be like, where do I start with trying to help with the, making homes in my community more energy resilient or more weatherized or get solar out there. And what a great like framing of, your whole book and this like topic of, hey, these folks are particularly at risk and particularly in need. Why don't you start here, this
Start
population?
there.
Yeah.
Exactly. And, the whole goal that we all share, I think, is to convert our housing stock into a more climate ready housing stock.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There are some people who are going to be first adopters and quick adopters of that, but there's a whole bunch who are going to be absolutely overwhelmed, unable to even handle the complexity of this. And moreover, older adults are often targets of fraud.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of shysters out there who are trying to take advantage of older adults and prey on their isolation and maybe the complexity of some of these programs. So the degree to which you as a local government official can work through trusted intermediaries to bring some of these resources to older adults, like access to the energy rebates, like access to benefits to install solar, frankly, just connecting them to like LIHEAP programs that they could sign up for that reduce their energy costs. Those are really important connective tissue actions that local governments can make, because again, the resources are out there. But for an older adult who is isolated in their home, who is financially insecure, who may be living with dementia, who may be, frankly, spending a lot of their emotional energy just on their health, it takes a little extra effort to serve those folks. But that's really where our focus needs to be.
Yeah. Yeah. What about kind of on the emergency management lens? So like we've talked a little about some of the day-to-day things or that are impacting older adults. So when there's an actual emergency or maybe in prep just to set up your systems before the emergency comes, what are some of the emergency management things that like, if I'm an emergency manager in a local government or I'm a leader in local government or I want to make sure this group is taken care of, like what are some of the things they should keep in mind from that kind of silo?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is to find out who your older adults are and where they are and what their needs are. And I say that because you would think that that's already happening, but I think in many cases it's not. And I distinctly recall being in a county up in upstate New York after I did a talk up there and was invited by the Department of Aging in the county to talk about my book and talk about this issue. And they were really wise. They brought together the town planners. They brought together the environmental folks who were managing some of these IRA resources. They brought together the emergency managers. They brought together the home care industry representative and, a whole bunch of other folks. And together we were able to, and I could see with my own two eyes, the connections being made across these departments. So for example, the emergency management folks were sitting there saying, we've done cooling shelters, but no one comes.
Yeah.
I don't understand. Only 3 people came. I guess we don't need them. Or maybe it was warming shelters in the case of upstate New York. The point being, they hadn't quite figured out the transportation component of that shelter. And yet their counterparts at the Department of Aging could very clearly describe what are the transportation and mobility needs of older adults because they serve them every day. Those are the folks who deliver Meals on Wheels and deliver other services that acknowledge people's mobility realities, their transportation realities. So I would say, for emergency managers, it's important to understand who your older adults are and what their needs are. So you could do that by connecting with your area agency on aging, understanding who are they serving and working together to get critical information to those folks, because the area agency on aging is a really important partner in this. Again, they're not naturally sitting at the same table, those two entities, but they need to be. The other thing that emergency managers can do if they don't already is start a special needs registry. And this is a voluntary way for older adults or people with disabilities to sort of self-select and self-identify and make their needs known in advance. And that might mean, I don't drive. I'm going to need an accessible paratransit vehicle to pick me up if we need to be evacuated or if you need to get me to a shelter. But it might also mean that I've got pets, and I'm not going to leave my house unless there's a plan for my pets. So, which is a very real consideration for many older adults. So a special needs registry can be as much or as little as a locality wants it to be. Yeah. But I think it becomes a really important part of exactly understanding who older adults are, being realistic about who they are, where they are, and what their needs are. Because I think without that, there's kind of this predisposition to plan for the nursing home, plan for the assisted living facility, and kind of check the box and things that, okay, we've taken care of older adults.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it takes much more than that, obviously.
Yeah. No, that's a really great point. Because I think, yeah, that's the easiest folks maybe to work with is that there's a population at the assisted living facility
Yeah.
that, hey, I can talk to one person that runs that facility and touch a lot of folks, which probably is important, but
It is
that's not
important.
the whole population.
Exactly. It's a very, very small portion. And to be honest, I don't know about you, but I'm a little haunted by some of those pictures that I saw in Hurricane Katrina
Yeah.
of older adults who were living in nursing homes who were submerged in water because they couldn't be evacuated. So my mind kind of almost naturally gravitates to older adults in congregate facilities. But again, the reality is it's a very small portion of older adults, and many older adults live alone and are just not getting that kind of attention or care or focus.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, another piece that I think you touched on a little bit was the mobility. Obviously, in the day to day, the transportation systems being designed for older adults will help. But in the kind of event of emergency, is it just connecting them with the right, or like you said, developing a strategy to be like, hey, we're going to evacuate. This is what you need to evacuate. This is how we're going to take care of your pets. Or are there other things that local governments keep in mind around the mobility side of this when it comes to kind of emergency management?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways to tackle that. I think one is if you're thinking about mobility and evacuation, again, have a plan in place. I think what we saw in the Lahaina wildfires was a lot of people who, on a day-to-day basis, relied on friends or family to drive them places, ended up being stuck and out of options because those people couldn't get to them in time. So, if someone is in that bucket where they rely on friends or family for transportation, for local governments or for nonprofit organizations, kind of think in advance of like, how do you reach those folks? How do you prop up or utilize a volunteer driver program? In many communities, there are volunteer driver programs to help older adults. Those programs can be leveraged in disaster as well, or at least should be part of the mix. The other thing is, I would say, with some of the federal programs like the paratransit programs that are funded by DOT, many of those programs, as far as I understand, do not require plans for disaster. So there are federal funds going into paratransit systems, serving the needs of people with disabilities or who are mobility impaired, but they aren't required to plan for how they would serve people's needs during disasters. The Washington State Department of Transportation is an example of a state DOT who said, you got to do that. If you're getting federal dollars, we want you to think about what that means during disasters. But many state DOTs do not do that. That's not to say that a local government couldn't ask their Department of Transportation or their MPO to articulate their vision as well.
Yeah.
And then again, another thing I sort of talk about in the book was this idea of shared use agreements. So if there's a bus system or transportation system that the school system has, or the healthcare facility has, or the university has, can you write a shared use agreement in advance of a disaster so that can be deployed in times of disaster? You don't want to be worrying about like, what do I have permission to do? Who do I need to ask when disaster strikes? You want to know who you can call, what's available, what their accessibility requirements or capabilities are, so that they can be deployed instantly. Yeah. And then the last thing I would say is kind of in the vein of volunteer driver programs. There are things called villages, which I didn't learn about until I got to AARP, which is not a physical location. A village is sort of a group of people who join, who affiliate with one another to help older adults age in place. And that village is an organization that is sort of hyper local. Members pay a small fee, a few $100s a year maybe, and that avails them of volunteer help with driving, with sometimes home maintenance, as well as like social activities like, book clubs and lunches and things like that. So find out if your community has villages in place, because already there you've got a volunteer network of people who are augmenting the transportation needs for older adults. So, think about resources like that too.
Yeah. That's interesting. That's a really cool little program.
Yeah.
I was like, I'd love that, just, having young kids, but
yeah, right.
Well, and some of the programs even that you highlighted there, I bet in some organizations like your Parks and Rec department might be doing some of those things and know some of that population. And so again, in the the vein of busting down silos, like making that connection between emergency management and planning and transportation and those folks too. Yeah.
Absolutely. And this is where I'll give a shout out for the age-friendly program that AARP runs, this network of age-friendly states and communities. It's designed with exactly that intent, which is to say we as a community, and it has to be kind of, embraced or signed off on by an elected official, but that community commits to like a journey of becoming more age-friendly. And that means that they are going to bring in their parks department and their transportation department and their, village, if it exists, and the area agency on aging. Hopefully they're all sitting around the same table to kind of look at what are the elements in our community that are serving older adults needs well, and which ones need to be bolstered. And that becomes then a forum for that kind of planning and decision making.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So the area agency on aging, I remember seeing that in the book and being like, what is this? Is that
right?
Like typically where does that live? Is that like a state agency?
No,
county?
it's county. It's usually at the county, which is again, one of these quirks of like how we organize programs, right? The Area Agency on Aging is an incredibly important resource for older adults. It is the mechanism that deploys all the Older Americans Act funding, which is meant to support older adults. That usually sits at the county level though. So localities, cities may not even have any intersection point with the Area Agency on Aging. But again, I think it's one of those relationships that needs to exist. Yeah. I talk in the book about Portland and Multnomah County as being a good example of a community that is doing this really well, in part because City of Portland 20 years ago decided to sign on with the World Health Organization, who is the originator of this age-friendly framework. And they decided to work to become an age-friendly community. Over time, the county then joined as well, the Multnomah County in which Portland sits or is adjacent to. And together, it was that city-county affiliation that really helped them respond to the heat waves in 2021, because they had the emergency management folks who also sat at the county level, sitting next to the Area Agency on Aging folks, also sitting at the county level, working with the city folks who manage the housing and transportation. In that case, it's a regional transportation, but the housing and transportation decisions that were being made. And so they could just be in unison and think more proactively together about how to solve these problems. But again, it really comes down to busting silos down.
Yeah. I love that. All right. Are there other examples of communities that are doing a good job with centering kind of older adults and their resiliency plans, or some of the work there are other places you want to highlight that are doing good work in this area?
Yeah. And another one that I love to talk about is New Orleans, not just because it's been such a punching bag for climate fuel disasters. I mean, just time and time again, city of New Orleans just gets hit over and over. What I think is interesting, and what I learned from, again, talking to their Area Agency on Aging and some of the local folks there, there's a group called NOLA Ready, or Ready NOLA, which is the city group, the city government group that is leading the response efforts and the emergency preparedness efforts. They've kind of shifted their focus over time from evacuation, because we now know that evacuation can be really detrimental to older adults' health and well-being, to their mental health, to their physical health. There have been several studies, or at least a couple that I know of, that show worse health outcomes for older adults when they're evacuated. And so they've kind of shifted. It's not to say they don't evacuate people at all anymore, but they've shifted now to sort of how can we help people remain in place safely and endure longer term power outages, which is increasingly common. And it's been interesting to watch that evolution. I think in New Orleans, they've adopted a number of policy enhancements along the way to do that. But they've also really leaned, I think, on the role of the nonprofit sector. And in this case, there's a group called Together New Orleans that created what they call community lighthouses, which are effectively resilience hubs scattered throughout the community. So they're associated with community health centers or with churches or senior centers. But the thing is, they're all in walking distance of where older adults live. They have renewable energy on the rooftop and battery storage, so they can keep the power on. They can keep people's devices charged. They can provide heating and cooling as is needed. It can be a central place for sharing food and water as needed. And the thing about that is, it's not just the physical structure, but they also are accompanied by volunteers and sort of a social network component that goes out and talks to older adults before the disaster strikes, makes sure that they are known to the older adult before they need to come to the resilience hub in times of crisis. So and they know what to look out for. If they haven't heard from Mrs. Johnson in 24 hours, they know that they need to go knock on her door. So it's that kind of thoughtful planning, I think, centering the needs of older adults and acknowledging the realities that older adults face and the risks that they face from extended power outages. That is a perfect example, I think, of how we want to do better by our older adults in the future.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. And that's really cool. Like a place to like you said, New Orleans gets punched at a lot, especially in this topic area. So to see that they're doing really good work and kind of shifting their approach based on some of these lessons learned is really cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Any other organizations you want to highlight?
I'll give a shout out to another AARP shout out here. One of the things that I worked on before I left was a partnership with FEMA, which I think is really important. AARP is great at helping people be prepared for disasters. They work closely with American Red Cross to do that. But a partnership with FEMA, I think, bred some really interesting or manifested in some interesting products for folks, one of which was a toolkit that AARP created called the Disaster Resilience Toolkit that was sort of co-branded by FEMA. But at the same time, I think the unique piece of this is there was also kind of a sister publication that FEMA released, which was called Guide to Expanding Mitigation for Older Adults. So in that case, to me, it was a perfect illustration of FEMA is communicating to the people that it reaches, all the emergency managers out there in the world, with kind of an older adults lens. At the same time, AARP was communicating with the people who they communicate with, which is local leaders and aging advocates, to say, you need to be thinking about disaster resilience, and here are your counterparts in solving that problem. And so together, it was really this kind of unified message that is exactly the kind of thing that is needed as we move into this future of climate risks. We need to be able to bridge the gap between disparate silos and really center older adults' needs in our climate resilience planning. And I think those two resources are a great step in that direction.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, for our listeners, again, the book is Climate Resilience for an Aging Nation. It's out now. We'll make sure we link to where you can find it in the show notes for this episode. So, Danielle, anything else that you're working on that our listeners should look out for in the coming months?
Well, I would say if you're interested in affordable housing issues and climate-related issues there, we work a lot on how to bring climate investments into affordable housing. So I would say follow us at National Housing Trust. That's an idea for people who are thinking about housing and climate, not just for older adults, but people of all ages. And then in terms of, what's coming next, I guess in my dreamscape, I'd love to do a book like this, kind of focusing on lessons learned from overseas. I know that America is not alone, obviously, in both our demographic challenges and in our climate challenges. And in fact, some countries like Japan, they already have a significantly larger share of older adults and have experienced a lot of disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, and the like. And they've already adopted and implemented some really innovative solutions to kind of bridge those two things together. And I think that there's a lot of stories like that to be told. So, someday I'd like to go out and find out what some of those stories are and bring those back to the U.S. so that we can get some inspiration from overseas as well. But that's a little bit ways off. But in the meantime, I'm, just trying to get the word out on this issue and get people engaged and thinking about it.
I love it. And that seems like a great idea. Plus, if you could get, funding to travel the world to research these strategies, that sounds
right?
Great.
Yeah. It's not a bad plan. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. And then we have a traditional last question on the podcast. It's always the hardest. If you could be the Gov Love DJ and pick the exit music for this episode, what song would you pick?
The song that always brings me kind of joy and hope is the song "It's a Lovely Lovely Day" by Bill Withers. And then it was remade by Alt J, which is one of my favorite bands. So I'm going to go with that. "Lovely Day" by Bill Withers, and because any opportunity that we have to, I think about these issues and lean into solutions, to me that's what gives me hope, and that is what sort of makes me think that it's a lovely day.
I love that. Great pick. And Bill Withers is awesome. So awesome.
Love Bill Withers.
Well, that is our episode for today. Danielle, thank you so much for coming on and talking with me. I really appreciate you coming on, talking about the book, sharing your expertise and all the work that you've done. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ben. Appreciate it.
And for our listeners, GovLove is brought to you by engaging local government leaders. And the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. You can reach us online at elgl.org/GovLove. And again, you can give us a follow on LinkedIn at our GovLove podcast page. And you can become an ELGL member by going to elgl.org. Subscribe to GovLove on your favorite podcast app. And if you're already subscribed, hey, go share this podcast. Tell your friends, your colleagues, maybe an enemy. Help us spread the word that GovLove is the go-to place for local government stories. And with that, thank you for listening. This has been GovLove, a podcast about local government.
When the day that lies ahead of me seems impossible to face, when someone else instead of me always seems to know the way, then I look at you and the world's all right with me. Just one look at you and I know